Greetings, salutations, and welcome. It is only fitting that the first thing that I add to the Everything Alloy on video is actually a submarine, based off the success of my submarine video. So today I'll be talking about one of the most interesting submarines in world history, the U-88. It's from World War I, and it served in two separate navies, which I think is really cool. It wasn't just like possessed by two different navies, it actually did stuff for two different navies, which is really cool. It was built for the German Navy in 1917 from February to December. And then in 1918, it launched in January, where it did sea trials and ended up being rated for about 150 feet of diving. It tested all the way down to 160 feet, but it really should have only served at about 150 feet, which is simultaneously incredibly shallow, but also incredibly deep for the time. And then it went on patrol, and it patrolled from June of 1918 to November of 1918. In that time, it sank 14 enemy vessels, specifically merchant vessels. So those are not combat vessels. They weren't heavily armed or armored, but they were carrying war material and food throughout Europe, and that was part of the strategic plans were to sink these vessels. And like I said, it sunk 14 of them and damaged 2 others. In November, it was surrendered to the Americans. It was actually surrendered a little bit after the armistice, which makes sense. The armistice took a little while to fully get everything on board. And so on November 26th, it ended up joining the United States Navy, in which it would serve for the next 20 months. It went on a bond drive tour, which I think is really cool. So it ended up sailing all the way across the Atlantic and then up and down the eastern seaboard. It went to New York City, it went to Savannah, Georgia, Tampa, Jacksonville, all the way around there. It ended up going to Houston, Texas, New Orleans. It went up the Mississippi. It was supposed to get to St. Louis, but it didn't quite make it there, which is a bit of a shame. But I think it's so cool that a submarine actually went up the Mississippi. And then it went down through the Panama Canal and all the way up and down the West Coast. So I think it's one of the most well-traveled submarines of its era, at least in terms of number of ports of call, because it made just a ridiculous number of stops in Oregon and Washington, California, Mexico, Texas. It really is quite the interesting story. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that it couldn't travel that far. Remember, this thing is from the very early days of submarines, so it could only go a certain distance before it needed to refuel and refeed its people. In the German Navy, it had a crew of 34 people, 3 officers and 31 men. I assume in the U.S. Navy that it had a much smaller number, because why would they need that large of a number just to kind of shuttle it about? But it did have an escort and so on and so forth when it was doing its bond drive. Because remember, even though the armistice was signed, the U.S. government still needed money. People had to get home, material had to be shipped to Europe for, recovery. There was a lot that needed to be paid for. And so they did do this additional bond drive, and coming and visiting the submarine was a big part of that. So I think that calling it a national celebrity isn't too much of a stretch. Now, why do I have a piece of it in front of me here? Well, it spent about a year of its life in Long Beach Harbor, where it was slowly decommissioned by the United States Navy, and they stripped everything of value from it. They took its propellers off, which have a mildly interesting story. They ripped out all the wiring, pipes, the torpedo tubes, just about everything they could strip from it, they did. And they made this out of some of the bronze recovered from that. A lot of people will tell you online that this is made from the propellers of this vessel. That is simply not true, nor was that ever the plan. The propellers existed until at least 1923, but this was made in 1921. And the reason why I say that existed until at least 1923 is those propellers were stolen. And unfortunately, no one knows where they are today, and it's assumed that they were scrapped. If they weren't scrapped almost immediately for their value, I would imagine that they were scrapped during World War II, during some drive. And originally they were supposed to end up in museums and memorials and so on and so forth. So it's really quite a shame that they ended up being looted in that way. So they took that material out of the vessel and they made it into between 4,000 and 5,000 of these paperweights. and gave them out at a going away party for the submarine that was held in Long Beach. The reason why I say between 4 and 5,000 is we're pretty certain that they made at least 4,000 of them because there were invitations for 4,000 people sent out. And it says on the invitation that you'll receive one of these, which is kind of cool. But there's also some records that say that they made 5,000 of them. Now, I would imagine that they made more than they needed, because what if some of them got lost or they needed an extra one at the thing, at the big gala. So I would imagine that there are more than 4,000 of them out there, but I don't know if it's as high as 5,000. The other interesting thing is we don't know exactly how they were given out, and I think that's partially due to the fact that I think they were given out in multiple different ways. They claim that they were handed out like at the entrance when you showed up, but I think they might have been used as little table decorations, holding down name cards and so on and so forth. But what's also interesting is there's a large number of these that are framed in an identical manner. And I think that might be that some of them that weren't given away at the actual event were framed up by the Navy and were given away as awards or thank yous or what have you. Because, again, they're framed too similarly to not be from the same project. Now, what ended up of UB88? Well, it ended up being sunk halfway between Catalina and Long Beach, Catalina being a small island off the coast of California, and it was used as a gunnery target during that period of time. And it's still down there to this day. They actually discovered it in 2003 and determined that, sure enough, all the bronze and copper was stripped from it as much as they could see. Specifically, they checked for the torpedo tubes, which were gone, and they checked for copper piping, all of which was gone. There might have been some scraps left on it, but, that seems to be the way that it rests now down there at the bottom of the ocean. So this is actually a piece of both U.S. naval history and German naval history, and of course world naval history, being that it was a nice little U-boat that did its duty to two different nations, which I think is pretty cool. Now, I will be going silent here in a moment to remove material from this for the Everything Alloy. I want to be very clear. What I'm going to be doing is removing a little bit of material from the top of the periscope here. I hope you can see that. So that it doesn't interfere with the beauty of this object or any of its historical value. These are readily available online. They become available probably once a quarter. So if you do want one, you can look for them. There's a great resource for you if you want to go online. Just type in UB88, and there's an organization, and it is a .org that has a lot of good information on this vessel, a lot more than I have here. And they also talk about some of the disputes that are in its history because, again, this is, over 100 years ago. So there is some disputes as to what exactly happened. And I just want you to know that I'm going to be removing a very, very small amount of material from this. I will be removing it in 10 parts. Each part that I remove will be enough to be at least about 1,000 billion atoms, give or take a billion. The reason being is I want an alloy bar that is 1,000 grams, and I want each gram of that to have at least a billion atoms in it. If my math is correct, it would be about a billion atoms, but I can comfortably say that it'll be at least a billion atoms per gram. So it'd be 1,000 billion, or at least 1,000 billion per jar. And I'll be doing that in relative silence because I need to count my 10 strokes from the file. So if you want to bow out from this video now, you can do that. I may even have to jump cut, and I apologize for that. But I appreciate you joining me on this little dive into history, and I hope to bring you another interesting artifact next week. I may talk to you guys a little bit in between filing. I may not, because there's a lot of noise going on outside, and I'm very happy with that take, and I prefer to not reshoot this. I've already reshot this at least 5 or 6 times. I've only gotten to the collecting part once before, though. So it's not like I kept grinding and grinding and grinding away on it. I have collected it before, but I haven't collected it on camera. So that's going to be new. But there's a lot of noise going on outside, so I may edit some of that out. But I want you guys to kind of hear the filing noises and the slight little clanking. I don't know, I like the little noises a little bit, tiny bit like ASMR. I do intend for people to use these as videos to go to sleep, at least I hope. And so I like to have my voice at relatively the same level. I'm trying to not make loud noises, although the clanging of the glass probably doesn't help people sleep. I should probably put a small piece of paper down underneath the collection jar so it doesn't move. But we'll do that next time. The point is to get this done now, because I want to get this video live. I thought it'd be fun to also put some, Imperial German era coins out here. If you're counting my strokes, if I don't consider the stroke good enough, I redo it. So I apologize there. I tried to ramble through the history real quick so that you guys can get the details, and it could be a fun and exciting video. And then this is where we kind of calm down. I know that's going to hurt my viewer retention, but, who cares? So when you think that I'm removing such a small amount of material, why would it matter? I'll probably say this in every video, but the amount of material I remove, I used to believe, but I don't know if it's true actually, that if it were cyanide, it would kill you. So that doesn't make it seem so small now, does it? But I need to redo the math on that. And I promise you I'll redo the math on that before I see you guys next week. These jars have all gotten it before for sure, so I'll be a little sloppier with them. The new jars, of course, are new for the video series, so, those have to be a little bit more precise. But yeah, pretty cool that this thing traveled so much. I also like that apparently nobody died on it, which I think is pretty cool. It did unfortunately sink a few vessels. Which I'm sure that was not good for the people on the vessels it sank. But when I collect this sort of stuff, I like to avoid stuff that is directly involved with the deaths of people, but it's hard with Militaria. I like to say that I like the materials of war, but not war itself. Because it's really fascinating what we have done to harm each other, unfortunately. But still interesting nonetheless. So you see there's definitely been material removed, but it doesn't really impact the overall experience of the object. Frankly, I'm probably doing more damage to this poor thing by touching it so much. But if you look at it, it's pretty shoddily cast. I actually really like that it has like a big casting bubble. I also like that it's clear that it was like stamped, Anyway. So I really appreciate you making it this far, if you have. And I will be seeing you next week with another video on another historical object. I do want to keep this in the background of videos, but we'll see how long that lasts. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a lovely day, and I wish you nothing but the best.